So welcome to the Significance of Metaphors workshop. Now, throughout this workshop, there's going to be some exercises that I encourage you to pause the recording and do the exercises and reflect on them. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen so that you have it and you'll see a slideshow. Okay. Okay. Significance of metaphors. I wanted to do this brief workshop on metaphors for a particular reason. For those in self-concept and familiar with self-concept work, as you know, we create a metaphor for every quality we work with and add it into our database. However, I have noticed that sometimes this particular area is not taken with too much importance, can be easily dismissed, or the reasoning behind the addition of a metaphor isn't fully understood. So let's explore the significance behind metaphors and get a better appreciation for them. Because as the quote states, the metaphor is perhaps one of man's most fruitful potentialities. Its efficacy verges on magic, and it seems a tool for creation, which God forgot inside one of his creatures when he made him. Okay. This slideshow shows just how prevalent metaphors are in our language and how our brains process them based on findings from functional MRI studies. Interestingly, the way we process metaphors is a bit different from how we process literal language. Metaphors are everywhere in our everyday conversations, in poetry and literature, and even in scientific research, where they're often used to help communicate complex findings to non-experts, us, the public. Researchers have found that we use metaphors every 20 to 25 words. That's about 6 metaphors a minute in normal conversation. Brain imaging studies indicate that when you hear a metaphor, such as "it was a rough day," regions of the brain associated with tactile experience are activated. If you hear "he's so sweet," areas associated with taste are activated. Grasping at straws, regions involved with motor perception are activated. While the left hemisphere of the brain is primarily involved in language processing, both the left and right hemispheres are active for comprehension of metaphors. Given these findings, researchers are continuing to explore how metaphoric language can be used to improve moods and what role metaphors can play in learning abstract concepts. In ancient Greece, the original meaning of the word metaphora was transportation, to carry something from one place to another. It comes from the Greek roots pherin, meaning to carry, and meta, meaning beyond or over. That's the essence of a metaphor. It carries meaning across contexts. As Steve Andreas explains in Transforming Yourself, a metaphor gives you a summation of the feelings tied to the experiences it represents. A summation of the feelings tied to the experiences it represents. It lets you step into the emotional core of many experiences at once. And that can be incredibly motivating. In self-concept work, a powerful metaphor gives you the sense that you can carry that quality into any situation, even unfamiliar ones. Whenever we explain something by saying it's like something or using a metaphor, Phrases such as, I feel like, this is like, it's as though, or it's as if, those all trigger metaphoric thinking. So what does all of this actually mean for us in day-to-day life? Metaphors help us put words to things that are otherwise hard to describe, like a feeling we can't quite explain, a complicated relationship, or an abstract idea like freedom or grief. They take something vague or emotional and turn it into something concrete and shareable. That's why metaphors can be so powerful. They don't just describe an experience, they actually mirror it. The structure of someone's metaphor often matches how they feel or live through something. For example, someone might describe burnout as I'm running on fumes, which instantly gives you a sense of exhaustion, depletion, and having no reserves left. But after some recovery or positive shift, they might say, I'm starting to feel recharged again. That change in metaphor reflects a real internal change in their experience. And that's the interesting thing. When someone's experience changes, their metaphor usually changes too. Someone who used to say, I'm stuck in a rut, might start saying things like, I've turned a quarter, or I'm finding my flow again. Metaphors have three really powerful qualities. They're vivid, compact, and they give shape to what's hard to express. As researcher Andrew Ortney put it in Metaphor and Thought, metaphors give form to something vague, unknown, or hidden. And that's what makes them so emotionally impactful. In the book Clean Language by Judy Reese and Wendy Sullivan, there's a powerful exercise that uses coins to demonstrate the emotional impact of metaphors. I've adapted a bit for our setting. Let's try it together so you can get a feel for how metaphors reach beyond words and affect us emotionally. Since many of us nowadays don't carry coins around, just look around and notice objects near you. Maybe a pen, a piece of paper, your phone, or anything else within reach. Notice the different sizes, shapes, colors, and weights of these objects. Take a moment to get a sense of them, what they might even represent to you, what kind of energy or meaning they hold. If you need to, pause and think about that for a moment. Now, using those same objects, arrange them and name them to represent you and the people closest to you. That might be your family, close friends, or anyone really important in your life. Let yourself really see these objects as stand-ins for those individuals. Now imagine, just for this exercise, that one of them has to be removed. Not by choice, but by circumstances beyond your control. Which one would you choose to remove permanently? What just happened inside of you as you made that decision? Feel free to pause the recording, reflect, and journal. Now go ahead and return that object to where it belongs. Notice how this simple metaphorical exercise can evoke a real emotional response. That's the power of metaphor. It makes the abstract personal, the invisible visible, and the intangible felt. And here's another question to reflect on regarding that exercise. What did this metaphor reveal to you about your relationships, your values, or how you respond to loss or change? You like? So pause the recording, reflect, and journal. Metaphors versus symbolism. When we talk about metaphors in our self-concept work, we often use the words metaphor and symbolism somewhat interchangeably, but there is a difference. And I want to mention it briefly for reference. As the slide shows, a metaphor is made up of multiple components. Those are what we call symbols. The metaphor is the whole picture, and the symbols are the individual parts that make it up. Take this example. I feel like my back is pinned against a wall. That's the full metaphor. Now, if we break it down, we can see several symbols inside of it. I, my back, and a wall. Right? And there's also a fourth symbol that's implied, the thing or person doing the pinning. The four forms of metaphors, as discussed in Metaphors in Mind. These forms of metaphors, which I'll discuss shortly, describe the way the metaphor is expressed, how the metaphor is delivered, its medium. Metaphoric expressions can be spoken or written. These are verbal metaphors. Some are overt, meaning they clearly evoke vivid imagery or a strong felt sense of an experience that may be hard to describe elsewhere. Others are embedded. These subtly reveal how someone is mentally representing or doing the experience they're describing. The next slide describes this more in depth. Here are some examples of verbal metaphors we use all the time in everyday language. Overt metaphors are the more obvious ones. You can hear the imagery in these. I have my head in the clouds. I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders. I have a knot in my stomach. Each of these gives you a strong felt sense of what the person is experiencing. I have my head in the clouds, confusion. I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders, stress. I have a knot in my stomach, anxiety. Then we have embedded metaphors, which are more subtle, like she got out of a relationship. This treats the relationship as if it were a physical container she was inside. Or, I see what you mean. That maps understanding onto vision. And the deadline is approaching. That's treating time as if it were a moving object. We use these all the time without realizing it, but each one reveals something about how we experience and mentally organize our world. So how does your experience change with different embedded metaphors? Let's look at how your experience shifts when you hear the same sentence with different embedded metaphors. Listen to the difference in how each one feels to you. I'm thinking about what you said. I'm thinking over what you said. I'm thinking around what you said. I'm thinking beyond what you said. I'm thinking past what you said. I'm thinking outside of what you said. I'm thinking through what you said. I'm thinking on what you said. Each of these subtle changes reveals a slightly different way of mentally navigating the same idea. So take a moment to notice what changed in your experience as you heard these. If you want, pause, reflect, and journal. Let's talk briefly about nonverbal metaphors. These are typically expressed through behavior and body language. They include things like body and eye movements, posture, facial expressions, and even nonverbal sounds, grunts, coughs, sighs, hems, and haws. For example, clenching fists can metaphorically show anger. Hand gestures might express anxiety, the spin or direction anxiety is moving in for someone. Pushing away with your hands can represent rejecting an idea or a person. And sounds like nervous laughter, throat clearing, or little vocalizations like ah, oh, or all of these can be metaphorical cues that something meaningful is happening internally, even if it's not said out loud. So take a moment and ponder your own nonverbals when you're annoyed or overwhelmed, and consider if there's a metaphor behind it. If you like, pause the recording, reflect, and journal. Now, let's look at material metaphors. These are physical objects or environments that metaphorically represent something else. You see this often in coaching or therapeutic work. For example, in parts integrations, a chair might be used to represent one of the client's internal parts. In business, people often talk about climbing the ladder to success. Here, the ladder becomes a metaphor for career progression. Lighting a candle can symbolize setting an intention or inviting transformation. And a bridge might be used to represent a connection between ideas or crossing from one state of being to another. Sometimes the same physical thing can be literal or metaphorical. It depends on the context. For instance, someone might say, I'm at a crossroads. That literally could mean they're standing at the intersection of two streets. But in the context of a relationship or life decision, it's a metaphor. It represents a moment of choice between different paths or directions. Now, imaginative metaphors. These are metaphors created in the mind or through guided imagery. They happen in the subjective world of thoughts and feelings. And often when someone visualizes or senses something as part of their internal experience. This could include seeing objects, in your internal landscape, hearing inner dialogue, or feeling emotions and body sensations. In a way, you're creating a kind of personalized virtual reality. For example, you might visualize your inner critic as a snarling dog behind a fence, aggressive, contained, and maybe even wounded. Or you might picture your heart locked inside a chest, symbolizing emotional shutdown. Someone might describe anxiety as a tangled ball of string in their stomach. You might view an objection in a parts integration as an image, like seeing your inner child. These kind of metaphors are deeply personal and powerful because they reflect how someone internally experiences the world. Ways we use metaphor and self-concept and how they show up. In self-concept work, we purposefully and strategically add a metaphor to represent a quality. For example, a turtle might represent tenacity, a heart for loving, a lion for persistence. That metaphor captures the feeling behind all of your positive experiences with that quality, which is why it can be so emotionally impactful, inspiring, and motivating. It allows us to carry meaning across different contexts and helps us generalize being that quality in any situation, even in unfamiliar settings or with people we don't know. Because instead of relying on a specific memory or example, the metaphor becomes a shortcut to the feeling of the quality. So you can access it instantly, no matter where you are or who you're with. I remember a client once told me she added a parachute as a metaphor in one of her quality databases. As a kid, her gym class used parachutes during playtime. Everyone would lift it up and all the kids would run underneath. A few days after doing self-concept work together, she texted me a photo. She'd seen a group of kids at a backyard birthday party playing with a parachute, and she snapped a picture of it with an arrow pointing to the parachute. She said it instantly brought her back to her quality, and she said, what a pretty neat coincidence. That's the power of metaphor. It becomes a living, portable experience that reconnects you to yourself. Where metaphors show up in self-concept work. For those of you familiar with self-concept work, you know that summary representations are quick, simplified mental images that stand in for a quality in someone's self-concept, and they should be representative of you. In Transforming Yourself, Steve Andreas gives the example of a chair. When someone says chair, we all instantly get a personal reference of a chair. Maybe a generic shape, the sound of it sliding across the floor, or even the feel of sitting in one. That representation is a shorthand, a kind of handle to a suitcase that holds all your specific memories of chairs over your lifetime, bundled into one quick representation. Similarly, when we are exploring positive examples of a quality, a metaphor might arise as a summary. I once had a student who pulled up athletic as a quality, and the image that popped up was a trophy. It wasn't a specific memory, it was a metaphor that summed up the energy he felt in all his athletic experiences and accomplishments. Sometimes you'll get a vague or stylized image instead of a clear memory. It might look cartoonish, colorless, or set in a nondescript background or setting. That's often a metaphor or abstraction stepping in. And metaphors show up a lot in counterexamples too. Memories where we don't feel like we are being the quality we value. I've noticed this can be a kind of unconscious buffering or emotional protection for some people. For instance, a client once saw a nefarious spy sitting at a computer. It was like malware. This metaphorical character was blocking her from accessing her counterexamples. But as you all know, the goal in self-concept work that we do, it's to move beyond those metaphoric summaries in our counterexamples and find the specific detailed memories. That's where the real transformation begins. And that's where all the real transformation happens. When we can learn from what happened and choose a new way of being if it were to happen again. Metaphors can also show up inside specific detailed memories. I remember a client who revisited a counterexample and noticed a dark, shadowy figure standing behind her mom. As we explored it, she realized it represented fear and ultimately was a protective figure. Once she uncovered the positive intent, she found new resources to satisfy it. She rewrote the memory, and in her new movie, that figure eventually dissolved into light. Personally, I love weaving metaphors into my new movies. The unconscious mind loves novelty, and metaphors make resources more emotionally accessible to me. If I want to access love, I might picture a glowing heart in my scene. If I want empowerment, maybe I imagine myself wearing Wonder Woman bracelets. For me, new movies, the new transformations we're creating, are often a blend of detailed reality and symbolic metaphor, because both have significance. Metaphors can also appear during congruence checks. When someone faces an objection that's hard to articulate, they'll often use a metaphor to describe what it's like. In one of my Projects for Change calls, a student once said that being a certain quality felt unattainable. When I asked how so, they replied, "It's like a kid trying to reach a cookie jar on a high shelf." That's a metaphor. It reveals the emotional distance between where they are and where they believe they need to be. And we can work with that image to create more choice. Metaphors also show up when we do boundary work. For those of you familiar with self-concept work, you know we explore boundaries, or essentially the extent of our self-concept. We look at how we internally represent these boundaries, both around us and within us, and then adjust those representations to create more flexibility and choice in how we respond. For example, someone might represent an external boundary as a concrete wall, 5 feet away, 8 feet tall, wrapping around them in a square. Instead of analyzing what the metaphor means in self-concept work, we focus on the structure of the metaphor. We might make the wall transparent, push it further back, soften the texture, maybe from concrete to plaster, all in service of helping the person become more resourceful while still honoring the protective function that boundary provides. Internal boundaries often show up in even more symbolic ways. Someone might picture their heart caged in an iron wrought prison as a way of showing how closed off they feel to love. I'm going to show you a 3-minute video of student Joel Chernoff, who describes the metaphor that came up for him during some boundary work, and how, by exploring its positive intent, he experienced a profound internal shift. Let me stop this share for a moment and share this.
The metaphor stemmed from a boundary. I found these edges of this boundary, and it turned out to be this armor that lined it was a key because it brought me to I'm working from an outdated system. I'm working with an outdated sort of program. I turned the key and all these latches opened up, but it wasn't done. The armor was encased in a sarcophagus. I was like, how do I open this up? And it opened up eventually, and I'm talking to this boundary. The next minute, I'm sitting on a beach with a giant cliff behind me, and the sarcophagus opened up. And then there was a part of me, and I saw it was this little kid. And it was me when I was very little. I had a brain tumor, like 4 years old. So I spent a lot of time in the hospital. And this little kid was pretty much naked, and he was sitting on this like cove, and he couldn't communicate. It almost like he's in shock. I spent a couple of days working with him, and finally I was like, okay, we can't sit here forever. We have to move on somewhere. I could see all the scars from the operations and stuff. And so finally I was like, okay, what do you need? And it wouldn't communicate in speech, but I need to heal came through. I need time. I never got to heal. And I was sort of abandoned. So I processed it. This part has started to represent my authentic self. And I realized that I was trying to force to get something while I was running away, while I was trying to alleviate the uncomfortability, being exposed. There was something about connecting to that part, and that part was fully exposed, and that it had no place to hide. And as I process it more and more now, it comes up in communicating with my son, with other people. It's I have nothing to prove. There's no fight. I felt like this part was reminding me not to force him, not to push that part, and to let that part heal the way it's got to heal, and not to have a preconception of what that looks like. And I felt like the metaphor was that part sort of saying, remember, I'm reminding you when you're going against your values. Fighting and struggling and trying to run, you're going to get the opposite result you're looking for, which is to chill and look at it. It's enjoyable. You can enjoy it. It doesn't have to be a forced thing. And I don't feel an urge to perform. It feels great.
So that's metaphors and boundary work. Some ways to unpack metaphors. One way to unpack a metaphor, especially during congruence checks, is to explore positive intention, just like Joel did in that video that we saw. You might ask questions like, what message do you have for me? What are you trying to do for me in a positive way? What are you here to help me do? What are you trying to protect me from, especially when they come up in counterexamples? What are you wanting me to know? If this metaphor had a value it was protecting, what would it be? Often just asking these questions allows the objection to soften and parts to begin integrating. Another way to work with a metaphor is to interact with its structure and gradually reshape it. Earlier, I mentioned the student who described equality as unattainable, like a kid trying to reach a cookie jar that's way too high. I asked, if you were that kid, what would you need to reach it? They said, a ladder. So I said, great, now you've got the ladder. Start climbing. They said, these steps are really far apart. I asked, what needs to happen for them not to be? They said, there needs to be more steps. And that simple shift, breaking it into smaller steps, was enough to start changing the metaphor of unattainability into something doable. It restored a sense of possibility. You can also create a complete reframe, which is more direct. It's a pattern interrupt style of intervention. This is where you outright challenge the metaphor someone is eliciting and awaken the giant within. Tony Robbins mentions an upset CEO who said, well, it's like they have us in a box with a gun to our heads. Robbins turned to the CEO and asked, what color is that squirt gun? The CEO looked puzzled and said, what? Robbins repeated the question, what color is that squirt gun? This broke the metaphor. Rather than unpacking it, it bypassed deeper inquiry and instead changed the meaning of the metaphor from the outside. You can also use the metaphor to trace back to a specific detailed memory. When a metaphor arises, it's often representing a pattern, not a single moment. So we can use a few different questions to trace it back to something real and specific. You might ask, as you notice this metaphor, can you get a sense of what context this is coming in? What time period or life stage might this be related to? Who else might be involved in this experience? Or you could follow the emotion inside the metaphor. What feeling is associated with this image? When's the first time you remember feeling that way? Does a particular memory or moment come to mind when you feel this? You can also use the metaphor's sensory qualities as a doorway. What does this image sound like, look like, or feel like physically? Have you ever experienced that texture, that feeling, or that setting before? And sometimes you can simply invite the unconscious mind to offer something up. As you sit with that image, that metaphor, what memory begins to surface, even if it seems unrelated? All of these questions help you move from symbol to story. And that's what allows you or your client to shift from interpreting the metaphor to integrating the experience it represents. Now, outside of self-concept work, there are modalities like clean language and metaphors of movement that allow you to unpack the metaphor by staying fully inside the client's metaphorical world. You don't interpret, you don't reframe, you don't analyze, you just explore. So if a client says, I feel like I'm walking through fog, you might ask, what kind of fog is that fog? Is there anything else about the fog? What happens right before the fog appears? What would that fog like to have happen? What needs to happen for that to happen? I once had a client say she kept hitting a wall. She described it in detail: 8 feet tall, 8 feet wide, and made of brick. She tried climbing the wall. She tried hugging the wall. She tried chiseling at the wall. Nothing worked. I asked what was to the left and right of the wall. She said nothing. So I said, what if forward isn't the right direction? That's when she paused and said, wait, I could just walk around it? And once she did, everything shifted. The wall ended up behind her. It began to change physically. It wasn't an obstacle anymore. It became a symbol of her strength and all of her life experiences, something that now supported her rather than blocked her. That's the power of letting a metaphor reveal its own solutions. Limitations of metaphors. We've explored the relevance and power of metaphors, how they can emotionally connect us to qualities, memories, and meaning. But now let's look at the other side, how metaphors can also limit us. Because metaphors describe one experience in relationship to another, they can actually narrow how we think about the original experience. And that narrows the meaning we can make from it. Simply put, as Tony Robbins wrote in Awaken the Giant Within, a whole set of rules and preconceived notions accompany any metaphor you adopt. All these filters impact your unconscious beliefs about people, possibility, work, effort, and life itself. Metaphors will affect your decisions about how to think, how to feel, and what to do. They will shape your actions. For example, if someone thinks of life as a battle, they might constantly feel the need to fight, win, or defend, even in situations where cooperation or rest would be more helpful. The metaphor itself narrows what they believe is possible. If someone describes love as a roller coaster, they might unconsciously expect drama and chaos and overlook calm, steady connection. The metaphor subtly trains the brain on what to look for. Earlier, I mentioned this metaphor of that upset CEO who said, it's like they've got us in a box with a gun to our heads. The metaphor carried intense emotional weight, implying entrapment, powerlessness, and danger. And then Tony Robbins simply asked, what color is the squirt gun? That one question reframed the metaphor entirely. It broke the emotional trance. The CEO paused and then actually laughed. Just like that, the fear collapsed. So while metaphors can be powerful tools for insight and motivation, they can also become filters, distorting or limiting what's possible, especially when we don't realize we're living inside of them. That's why becoming conscious of your metaphors is so important. Because once you see them, you can question them, you can change them, or you can walk around them, just like the client who was hitting a wall. The metaphors we use have a direct effect on the life we experience. So let's try a few on. Life is a game. Life is a problem. Life is an uphill struggle. Life is a battle. Life is a journey. Life is a circus. Life is an adventure. Notice how each one feels a little different. What changes in your body, your attitude, or your expectations depending on the metaphor you adopt? Feel free to pause the recording, reflect, and journal. This is why metaphors have limitations, especially when it comes to accessing specific detailed memories. Metaphors often lack the specificity we need for practical application. They don't actually show us how to be the quality. They give us the essence, but not the steps. Metaphors usually don't contain sensory-based information. What you see, hear, feel, or even taste or smell in real situations. So if a line represents persistence, great. But how do you actually show persistence at work, in a relationship? That's where specifics matter. By contrast, specific examples give you finer distinctions and richer learning. They show you how to embody the quality in real life. For instance, if you value kindness, specific detailed memories can show you exactly what kindness looked, sounded, and felt like, whether that was speaking in a warm tone, soft physical touch, or kind action taken in the moment. So in closing, what we've explored today is the incredible power of metaphor and also its limits. Metaphors help us capture the essence of who we are. They're emotionally resonant, motivating, and give us a felt sense of identity. But it's the specific detailed examples that show us how to live that identity, moment to moment, in real life with real people. When you combine the two, you get the best of both worlds, a self-concept that's not only deeply felt, but fully lived. And that's what this work is about. When we began this workshop, I mentioned how metaphors often get dismissed. They're seen as abstract, maybe even a little superficial. But now you've seen how deeply metaphors shape our thoughts, our feelings, our choices, how we show up in the world. They're not just part of our language, they're the structure of our experience. Metaphors may start as symbols, but they shape stories. They can free us or limit us. So now that you know how they operate, start listening to your metaphors more closely. Ask yourself, what metaphor am I living inside of? And is it one I want to keep? And take a minute and think about a quality you want to embody the most right now. What is it? And if you could choose any metaphor to represent that quality, what would it be? And why?